We are interested in whether the response to one categorical variable is associated with a particular response to another categorical variable. For example, is there an association between gender and having diabetes? Is there a relationship between how much students exercise, low, medium, or high, and how much their parents exercise, low, medium, or high? Is there a relationship between whether one has ever suffered from tonsillitis and whether they snore? In all these situations, we are considering whether, across a large number of assessed people or items, we see patterns between the responses to the two categorical variables on average. The first step would be to present the data in a table. Let's consider the pair of variables, tonsillitis, with possible responses of either yes or no, and snoring, also having the responses either yes or no, to see if they're related. In one study, there was information collected on 50 children. Here is the data for the first 10 children in the study. For each child, 2 responses were recorded, one relating to the presence of tonsillitis and one identifying whether or not they snored. So for each child, we have information on whether or not they snore and whether or not they have tonsillitis. Take the first child in the study. This child snored and had tonsillitis. The second child in the study snored and did not have tonsillitis. We record this data for all 50 children in the study. We can summarise the information for all 50 children using a cross-tabulation as displayed here. This is a table showing the information for both variables, snoring and tonsillitis, simultaneously, and shows how many times each combination of responses appears. Of the 50 children, 30 had suffered from tonsillitis during their childhood, while the remaining 20 children had not suffered from this condition. Of the 50 children, 18 snored, while the remaining 32 did not. So how can we use this summarised information to decide if there is indeed an association between having tonsillitis and snoring? Is it true that those with tonsillitis are more likely to snore? First, let's consider those with tonsillitis. Of the 30 children with tonsillitis, 15 did not snore and 15 did snore. Of the 20 children without tonsillitis, 17 did not snore and 3 did snore. Since we have different numbers of children in our study with and without tonsillitis, we consider the relative frequency through row percentages. Out of the 30 children with tonsillitis, 15 children, or 50%, snore. So 50% of those with tonsillitis do snore. What percentage of those without tonsillitis do snore? It's 3/20, or 15%. It is now much easier to compare the prevalence of snoring between those with and without tonsillitis. 50% of those with tonsillitis do snore, whilst only 15% of those without tonsillitis also snore. So it appears that those with tonsillitis may be more likely to snore, or that tonsillitis is related to snoring. Is the relationship statistically significant? If we took another sample of 50, we wouldn't necessarily get exactly the same numbers and percentages. The percentage of children with tonsillitis who snore may not be exactly 50%, for example. We refer to this as sampling variation. We perform a formal test or hypothesis test to check whether there is a statistically significant relationship between tonsillitis and snoring. When we are interested in determining whether two categorical variables are related, we may use the chi-squared test. The null hypothesis is stated as no relationship between tonsillitis and snoring. The chi-squared test compares the observed numbers with what we would expect to see if there was no relationship between tonsillitis and snoring. But what would we expect to see if there was no relationship? These are referred to as the expected counts if the variables are not related. So we need to work out the expected count in each cell of the table. Let's start with the cell corresponding to those with tonsillitis and who snore. We observed 15 people with tonsillitis who snore. If snoring and tonsillitis are not related, how many would we expect to see here and here? If the response to snoring is independent of tonsillitis, then the proportion of those with tonsillitis, which is 30 out of 50, should be reflected in the proportion who say yes to snoring and in the proportion who say no to snoring. So we expect these values to be 10.8 and 19.2. We repeat this for the other row of values and get 12.8 and 7.2. The chi-squared test evaluates the probability of observing such differences in observed and expected counts if, in fact, there is no association between the variables. This is a p-value, described in the video about hypothesis testing. In this case, the p-value would be 0.01, indicating a low chance of seeing such differences in our data if there was no relationship. At a 5% significance level, we would reject the null hypothesis and conclude there is a statistically significant association between tonsillitis and snoring.